Introduction to Egypt. Egypt, the land of pyramids and pharaohs, one of the most studied and scrutinized civilizations of the ancient world. Yet despite all the research and fascination, Egypt remains veiled in mystery. In this video, we'll explore how the Qur'an reveals secrets about Egypt that were lost to mankind for centuries. Pharaoh, a tyrant in Egypt, enslaved and persecuted the children of Israel. But the Qur'an provides us with details about Egypt's history and culture that have only recently been confirmed by modern archaeology. How could such knowledge be present in a text revealed over 1400 years ago? Let's find out. Pharaoh and the Pyramid Texts. Pharaoh, as described in the Qur'an, was not just a tyrant. He was a figure deeply revered by the Egyptians, almost deified. The Qur'an describes his death and the fate of his supporters with these words: "The heavens and the earth wept not for them, and they were not given respite." Qur'an 44-29. This phrase may seem simple at first, but it holds profound significance. Recently unearthed pyramid texts, which were inscribed on the walls of tombs and temples, give us new insights into this Quranic verse. The texts praise Pharaoh, claiming that upon his death he would ascend through the sky and become a star, claiming supremacy over the heavens. One text reads, "The sky weeps for you, the earth weeps for you, when you ascend to heaven as a star." The Qur'an, in stating that neither the heavens nor the earth wept for Pharaoh, directly counters these ancient Egyptian beliefs. What's astounding is that knowledge of the Egyptian language, particularly hieroglyphics, was completely lost at the time of the Qur'an's revelation. It wasn't until the discovery of the Rosetta Stone in the 18th century that mankind was able to decode these ancient scripts. This direct refutation of Egyptian adulations of Pharaoh, found in the Qur'an, is nothing short of miraculous. Pharaoh versus King. Quranic accuracy in titles. When you hear the word Pharaoh, what comes to mind? Most people think of the supreme ruler of Egypt. And while that's correct, the word didn't always refer to the ruler. Ancient Egyptian history is divided into different periods, and the term pharaoh had different meanings depending on the era. Historically, the word pharaoh, Egyptian per-aa, was used to refer to the royal palace and only much later became a title for the supreme ruler during the New Kingdom period. Before this, during the Middle Kingdom and Second Intermediate period, the rulers of Egypt were referred to as kings. Now let's analyze the Qur'an's accounts in light of these historical facts. The Qur'an discusses the prophets Joseph and Moses, both of whom spent time in Egypt. Scholars date Joseph to the Middle Kingdom or Second Intermediate period, well before Pharaoh was used to refer to the ruler. In the story of Joseph, the Qur'an consistently uses the word king to refer to Egypt's ruler, never once calling him Pharaoh. In contrast, Moses is dated to the New Kingdom period, a time when Pharaoh was indeed the title for the ruler. In the story of Moses, the Qur'an correctly refers to the ruler as Pharaoh. This precise use of language demonstrates an accurate understanding of Egyptian history that was not available at the time the Qur'an was revealed. The Bible, on the other hand, uses the term Pharaoh to refer to the ruler in both the stories of Joseph and Moses, which is historically inaccurate. How could the author of the Qur'an have known this, especially when the Bible was the only other source of information about ancient Egypt at the time? This accuracy points to a knowledge that goes beyond human capability. The size of the Exodus, Qur'an versus Bible. The Bible explicitly states that during the Exodus, the Israelite men alone numbered about 600,000. When you factor in women and children, the total number of Israelites would realistically be in the millions. This claim presents a logistical problem. First, Pharaoh is said to have appointed just 2 midwives to deliver and murder Israelite babies. If the Israelites were a vast nation of millions, 2 midwives would be insufficient for such a task. This implies that the Israelite population was much smaller. Secondly, the Bible mentions that after the Exodus, God informed the Israelites that they would not be granted the land of their enemies immediately because their numbers were too small to manage the land, and wild animals would overpower them. Again, this suggests that the Israelites were not a vast nation. By contrast, the Qur'an describes the Israelites at the time of Moses as a small band. This description aligns more closely with the historical and logistical realities of the time. The Qur'an corrects the contradictions found in the biblical narrative, providing a more accurate account of the size of the Israelite population during the Exodus. capital punishments in ancient Egypt. The Quran mentions that crucifixion was used as a form of punishment in ancient Egypt from the time of Moses all the way back to the time of Joseph. When we think of crucifixion, we often imagine the Roman cross, but in antiquity, there were different forms of crucifixion. Professor of Archaeology David Chapman notes that in studying the ancient world, it's important not to differentiate too rigidly between crucifixion, impalement, and suspension, as they were all forms of penal suspension. The Arabic words translated as crucified in the Quran contain the root word solab, which carries meanings such as to harden or stiffen, and to extract oily matter from bones. This word indicates any method of execution that results in the body becoming hardened or stiffened, including impalement and suspension. Archaeological evidence shows that the ancient Egyptians used to crucify people by impalement on a stake. For example, the Egyptian-German Dictionary of Hieroglyphics depicts an impaled man, a punishment used throughout different periods of ancient Egypt. The Abbot Papyrus, dated to the New Kingdom period, mentions an oath that includes impalement, and the earliest evidence of crucifixion by impalement comes from Papyrus Bulaq 18, dated to the early Second Intermediate period. These forms of crucifixion were carried out during both the New Kingdom period and the Second Intermediate period, covering the times of Moses and Joseph. The Quran's mention of crucifixion is historically accurate, correcting the limited understanding of the practice in the biblical narrative. Pharaoh's identity and the Quranic account. Neither the Bible nor the Quran identifies the Pharaoh of Moses by name. However, we can use the details provided in the scriptures to try and identify him. Both scriptures speak of the Israelites being enslaved before the birth of Moses. The use of Semites for slave labor occurred only during the New Kingdom period, allowing us to place Moses within this time frame, which gives us a list of 33 possible pharaohs. Both scriptures also speak of the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt. The Merneptah stele, an important artifact dated to around 1208 BCE, contains the first explicit reference to Israel in the archaeological record. This stele discusses the land of Canaan and mentions the Israelites in relation to Canaan, indicating that the Exodus had already taken place by this date. Since Merneptah was alive and in power after the Exodus, the pharaoh of the Exodus must have reigned before him. This narrows down our list of pharaohs and allows us to focus on Ramesses X, who ruled for 66 years during the New Kingdom period. The Quran depicts a single pharaoh reigning from the birth of Moses all the way up to the Exodus. The Quran informs us that Moses fled to Midian when he reached the age of maturity, which is defined as 40 years old. The Quran also tells us that Moses spent 8 to 10 years in Midian before returning to Egypt, meaning he was at least 48 years old at the time of the Exodus. Ramesses X, with his lengthy reign, fits perfectly with this timeline, aligning the Quranic account with historical evidence and correcting the chronological issues present in the biblical narrative. The miraculous preservation of Pharaoh's body. The Quran makes the following claim about the Pharaoh of Moses who drowned in the sea. This day we will preserve your body, so you can be a sign for those who come after you. Quran 10:92. This is a unique claim in the Quran, as it never makes such a statement about any other destroyed nations. Typically, the Quran mentions that the ruins and abandoned buildings of other destroyed nations serve as signs for later generations. This claim about the preservation of Pharaoh's body is remarkable. The body of Ramesses II was discovered by archaeologists in 1881 CE, and his mummy has been on display in the Cairo Museum, seen by millions of tourists over the last century. Sir Tony Robinson, in a documentary, stated that Ramesses II is one of the few pharaohs whose body has survived largely intact. Historically, priests concealed his body in a secret location around 1000 BCE because of grave robbers. Nothing was known about his mummy during the intervening period of almost 3,000 years. At the time the Quran was revealed, the whereabouts and fate of Pharaoh's body were unknown. It could have been damaged, stolen, or lost forever, locked away in its secret location, never to be rediscovered. The fact that the Quran accurately describes the preservation of Pharaoh's body is not only historically accurate, but also represents a bold prophecy. The Quran's insight into this matter demonstrates its divine origin, as no human could have predicted the discovery of Ramesses II's body after nearly 3,000 years. The plagues upon Egypt. a Qur'anic explanation. The Bible informs us about a series of plagues that God brought upon Egypt, including turning the Nile into blood, masses of frogs, swarms of mosquitoes, flies, the death of livestock, and boils on people and animals. At first glance, these plagues seem random and unrelated. However, the Qur'an sheds light on these events by mentioning a flood as the first punishment against Egypt. This detail, not found in the Bible, explains the seemingly random and unrelated plagues in the biblical narrative. A flood would result in high concentrations of red earth entering the Nile, causing a blood-like color, killing fish, and making the water undrinkable, as described in the biblical narrative. This phenomenon is historically attested to by a Middle Kingdom Egyptian sage who recorded that the river is blood, one shrinks from other people and thirsts for water. The other plagues also follow logically from the flood. Frogs, mentioned in the second plague, are known to proliferate after Nile floods. The death of the frogs, recorded in the biblical narrative, could have been caused by contamination of anthrax carried over from the rotting fish. Mosquitoes, mentioned in the third plague, would have thrived in the pools of water left by the flood. And swarms of flies, mentioned in the fourth plague, would have been attracted by the massive death of frogs. The death of livestock, mentioned in the fifth plague, could have been caused by anthrax, and the boils on humans and cattle, mentioned in the sixth plague, could have been caused by insect bites. The Qur'an's mention of a flood provides a logical explanation for the biblical plagues, showing them to be a series of interrelated events rather than random occurrences. The sale of Joseph and ancient Egyptian coinage. The Qur'an mentions that Joseph was sold for a paltry price in Egypt, using the Arabic phrase dirham madud, which translates to a small amount of countable silver. This description is historically accurate, as standardized units of silver were used in transactions in ancient Egypt. Small pieces of silver known as shat were used in trade, and the tomb of Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep, dated to the Old Kingdom period, contains a scene of a busy open-air market where goods were sold for units of silver. The Rind mathematical papyrus, dated to the Second Intermediate period, discusses the relative values of gold, silver, and lead in terms of shat, and small silver bars bearing the name of Pharaoh Tutankhamun, dated to the New Kingdom period, have been discovered. Until recently, historians believed that the minting of precious metals was a later Greek invention. However, these recent Egyptian archaeological discoveries have forced historians to revise their understanding of coinage in the ancient world. The Qur'an's accurate description of the sale of Joseph in Egypt, including the use of silver as currency, demonstrates a knowledge that was unknown at the time of its revelation. The Bible, by contrast, mentions that Joseph was sold for 20 pieces of silver, but this sale is said to have taken place with some Arabs outside Egypt, not within it. The Bible also contains anachronisms, such as the claim that a gold coin known as the drachma was used at the time of King David. However, historians point out that the drachma is named after the Persian leader Darius the Great, who lived hundreds of years after David. This demonstrates that the Bible contains historical errors regarding coinage, while the Qur'an's account is historically accurate. The mystery of Haman, Qur'an versus Bible. The Qur'an narrates a conversation between the Pharaoh of Moses and an individual referred to as Haman, where Pharaoh commands Haman to build a tower that would allow him to reach the heavens. Pharaoh's intention was not to literally scale a tower to reach the sky, but to symbolize the Egyptian belief that after death, the Pharaoh would ascend from earth to heaven, taking his place among the gods. Egyptian monuments housed the bodies of dead pharaohs and acted as bridges between this world and the next. The person in charge of constructing such monuments would need to be skilled in architecture and highly knowledgeable in religion, a builder priest of sorts. Historically, we know that Ramesses II was the pharaoh during Moses' time, so we focus on this period. A block statue in the Egyptian Museum of Munich contains a biographical account of a high priest named Baken Khonsu. In his own words, he states, "I am one truly reliable, useful to his lord, who performs beneficent deeds within his temple. I, being principal chief of works in the estate of Amun, erected obelisks of granite stone whose tops reach to the sky." Baken Khonsu served Ramesses II as both high priest and chief architect, constructing the temple of Amun at Karnak, one of the largest religious structures ever created. He had a long and illustrious career, serving as a priest for many decades. He referred to himself as Heri Hemnetier en Amun, meaning High Priest of Amun. The word Heri means servant, and Amun is the name of an Egyptian deity. The Quran's mention of Haman may be an Arabized version of the Egyptian Hemnetjer en Amun. It's important to note that the Bible also mentions a Haman, but he served under a Persian king and bears no relation to the Haman of Egypt mentioned in the Quran. This demonstrates once again that the Quran contains details that are completely missing in the biblical narrative, further validating its divine origin. Conclusion. In this video, we've seen that the Quran has a remarkable insight into many facets of ancient Egypt, revealing long-lost knowledge while also correcting the Bible. Claims that the Quran copied from the Bible are clearly refuted in light of these facts. The Quran boldly declares its origins as divine, a claim supported by its accurate knowledge of the unseen.